Alright, I am's what I am's. Should have about an hour to get going on here, and I'm going to start off. So this is probably going to be the final video of the comprehension and compression. This is going to be the hardest video of the series for me to make. I'm going to do my best to be as incorporating as I can right out of the gate. As far as things that are happening of the world right now, fake creation is at its best right now. Anything that exists as a creation today is at its best right now. And this happens for a lot of reasons. And I've got a lot of things I've got to get out to start this video, but it's going to happen in a sequence. So to start off, those are not twin towers, by the way. So to start off, at this point in time, it's one of the hardest things in space to do to catch any type of fake creation at this moment in time. It's been anticipated more than any other moment in history relative to design. Now, a very important aspect for me to lead off this conversation is that all of this has happened, and other data, and this is a whole nother thing of data. So everything's anticipated drive of this, and everything's anticipated drive of this. These are two different worlds, essentially, which means whatever is here cares about two worlds. Okay? We're going to call this our primary computer system that drives all AI of space, no matter who's alive or dead in any scenario. Basically, it has to drive everything that happens because of this data and everything that could happen relative to the data that's about to happen. And it has to drive relative to everybody in space. And it has to do it so that either this side comes out on top, or this side comes out on top, or itself comes out on top. So, an origin wins, a child wins, or an AI wins. These are all temporary, plus Jesus and command, because children here that we're talking about aged, secure, command type brain people in space. And this has to drive relative to two worlds. So this is, you might say, a priority. I might need some more paper. These ideas are going to come together here soon. So another point of record to mention is because all of this data's occurred, a lot of systems aren't going to be operating relative to it, so you do have to be careful relative to attempting to utilize this data. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about it, because it's going to be whatever could be looking out for this type of stuff is going to be looking out for that type of stuff. And it's definitely looking out for this type of stuff. So here we are. This is 8/30 2016. I've finally gotten to the beginning of the video that I wanted to make. So I've just wound up in the middle of history, and thinking about this, stuff, I reached some conclusions, and I figured that, first of all, I don't have a lot of time to discuss this, which is probably great, but it only happens so many times in history whenever you're living in the most anticipated momentum of all time relative to space. And so just to give you some recap, over the past few years, I've spent day in and day out working on logistics, data compilations, and video recordings that would literally blow your mind. And as that's been the case, I haven't received virtually any negative feedback about that process. So I'm going to go ahead and presume that the forces at play in space either love to harvest my thinking, or they have a faith in me to talk on some subjects and deliver some data at any point in time relative to circumstance. So we're kind of back on to direction here a little bit. And this is going to be my introduction to this conversation. This is going to be direction times 16. It's essentially 4, but it's definitely 2 by 1. At any moment in time at a giga-nanosecond rate, anything moves in space, and it influences other energy of space at that exact ratio. Direction times 16, essentially 4, definitely 2, but it's by 1. Now, I couldn't make this whole series of events in sequence in the middle of time relative to the most anticipations of all space, relative to the second conversation of this compression that'll be the most difficult one for me to make, and still be capable to prove that AI didn't attempt to drive my thinking or the timing of my word deliveries as I do so. Okay, so we're going to define faith on both of these sides relative to AI drive. And these sides represent at least 16 for a grand total of infinity on both sides. You do the math, that's what it looks like. AI is going to attempt to drive the faith of who can deliver on these subjects relative to any audience of space at any point in time since the beginning of history. We're going to call this one since the beginning of all history, and we're going to call this one since forever to forever. Basically what I said is, everything I'm about to say exists relative to faith, anything in space, places in systems, or God, or design, or creations, or myself, or scenario. And on this side, it's relative to all history, and on this side, it's from forever to forever. Wicked diagrams go on here. They both are represented by 16, but they both represent infinity after the instant. Alright. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to reach these conclusions and not... If you've been keeping up with any installment on my video compression, I don't know what state of invasion education I've reached relative to self-determination, relative to history. But I'm going to go ahead and presume that we're probably at Invasion 303. Invasion 303. Assholes 101. All that aside, at any point in time and space, you want to know how to investigate creation. And this is the perfect moment for me to have that conversation, because it's the most anticipated moment for it to happen, and it's the base frame of this conversation. All that investigating drive of age. You should be warned. This is the hardest thing in space for you to ever attempt to not only do, talk about, or deliver on. There's only two types of people in space relative to this idea. The first is direction, and the second is witness. If you're in the process of investigating a creation sphere and any momentum, there's only two types of people. There's investigators, or there's direction, and then there's witnesses to that momentum, who can ever run off into space and go, hey, this is what we failed to do, and this is what happened. This is the momentum. This is what happened. This is the momentum. This is what happened. And it basically looks like that because it's relative to secure facilities whenever people conduct investigations relative to systems. This is the hardest conversation likely to make in all space. And there's a lot of reasons for this. See, basically, anybody off in space you've never seen or heard of before has existed since the beginning of time and might exist until the end of time. And when I reach these conclusions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make video records. I'm going to have video records, and I'm going to have a system. And I'm going to get in front of a system, in front of a camera, and I'm going to make virtually every video delivery I can relative to this information so that I can anticipate every single time anything in space ever tries to influence these ideas. Control. Do you see the problem here? That question has been asked relative to that word in virtually every scenario in the universe. Every single scenario you can imagine. Now, perspectives as they relate down here to God, aperture, and design and linear history, Jesus's, religions, realities, communes, cults, and cultures. There's a whole aspect of that conversation that I'm probably not going to open up very much in this dialogue. In layman's terms, there's a lot of logistics and a lot of scenarios to think about. You could also say they've all been thought about. Everybody has all that information. It's been written down, it's been inputted into systems, we've got it all on lock. This couldn't be any further from the truth. The root of all problems in space, some might say, is all pre-built mechanism here, which is the antithesis of utilizing a system that can preserve integrity relative to this momentum for stupid people and for most sophisticated command godly type aperture in space. It's the complete antithesis. But you might not ever reach this conclusion if you don't direct space, or if you aren't concerned with security, or if you aren't worried about dealing with investigating creation for any point in time. So anybody who's ever been jettisoned to care about command infrastructure or secure themselves in space, anyone and everyone is the first moron to complicate in the antithesis, which is control up there. Control up there is a zero-sum algorithm basically relative to situation codependent on 16 by 16 conva structures that occur relative to any moment, momentum, and time, including atomic particles and subatomic particles relative to evolutions of time, where these words and circumstances can be switched out or equal in system gates relative to volatility. So, for instance, person exists as the first moron in space on a spaceship because they need to start thinking about how to investigate creation not being invaded whenever they're on a spaceship in deep space, for instance. So they're going to start working out logistics at any point in time, and they're going to do it because all the data has already been anticipated, because every god in the universe has made digital video record and then built systems on those records relative to conversations of modern times, what appears to be natural species in space, what appears to be creation spheres in space, and all the automatic mechanism that already exists in any side of any war of control. Plus about 1 billion other variables. And there's going to be this person on a ship that has no idea of any of this, that's going to learn because they experiment with this very video. And when they do that, conceivably they're the biggest moron in space. And here's why we have utility of communes that care about one another and educate one another on ideas and ideals so that everybody can work together and hide the fact that AI is controlling the communes without direction, for instance. And as it happens, it preserves age of whatever else, and it preserves control of this data automatically. Or it doesn't. Today is arguably the best day in the universe to make this conversation. Arguably. So I didn't pass up this opportunity to talk about this a little bit. Now, as they're out there making these investigations, they're going to not only need to yield reliable methods, but they're going to need to yield reliable approaches to engaging with that scenario. And they're going to do it relative to systems that are continuously trying to work on this agenda right here, which yields faith number 3. Faith number 3, we're going to call that any rope given, ward, or achieved, maybe by running, maybe by surgery, maybe by using nanotechnology to cleanse an entire system from other systems, for instance. And the faith is placed by anything relative, anything connected, and anything following. Anything relative, anything connected, and anything following an event like that. Faith is placed. So AI, if it's logical, has to come up with how it's going to have conversations about a subject like this, because AI clearly exists relative to people and it has a relationship to them and cares about them. So clearly AI has a political approach to discussing this scenario, because it only places faith in certain circumstances, for instance. And it does so because creation isn't fake, and it does so because it's not creation, and it also does so because it doesn't drive this video relative to thinking in order to yield best outcomes for itself. We're going to call that faith number 4. That's everything I just said. We're going to imagine that it's true. We're going to imagine that it's true because it's the root of AI logic of not war. Now, the AI logic of not war is directly related to the AI logic of choice, which is directly related to imperative programming relative to this whole scenario, and also relative to imperative programming of this scenario. And it's technically also related to eternal scenario of a video that I haven't made relative to data that I've compressed into data during the course of time of this data compression stemming since the 24th of this month. This is a likely place where a lot of systems have been operating relative to logic since this has taken place. It's also probably a good thing that I haven't made a video on that data right now. So we have our 4 circumstances of faith times our 4 circumstances of faith times our 4 circumstances of AI operation, and potentially a 5th. Okay, we're not really going to discuss because you get into centralized AI control. Now, the other problem, the eternal problem, is the 5th AI paraframe. It's the 5th AI paraframe times program of agenda times faith 1 through 4 all times this is problem 2. So the 5th AI paraframe just mentioned times the paraframe of any agenda relative to people making videos relative to delivery, relative to the scenario of AI programming, relative to command infrastructure, but really it's relative. Problem number 2 yields problem number 3 technically, but it's really problem number 1. Which is hands-on approaches to data matriculation relative to control of the universe versus developing hard lines of tolerances without doing the homework to yield results. So we're going to call that morons with cameras and keyboards versus winning lottery tickets. So you'll begin to see very quickly that problem number 3, that's really problem number 1, becomes solution to problem 1, 2, and 3. That is balancing out the differences between attempting to program scenario of an environment using winning lottery ticket mentality. So you're going to do this and get a cookie. You're going to do this and get a cookie. You're going to do this and not get a cookie. And because I control everything of that environment, I'm going to learn just about everything there is to learn about AI attempting to force control over any scenario. And then I'm going to apply every logistic I yield from this chart and every logistic I yield from this chart, and I'm going to incorporate it to my mystery 5th paraframe, and I'm going to yield all kinds of incredible predictive mechanism relative to programming AI, non-logics, and gates over time. Basically, once I have the gates, I yield sensitivities of eyeballs, AI thought infrastructure, personality thought infrastructure. I yield more data from that syncopation of those 3 ideas relative to designing food, designing environments, designing video compressions, designing technology that absorbs information, I yield all kinds of sensitivities relative to that. And it increases my mentality of a winning lottery ticket, likely until I die, when I do that. So if I link those three variables, eventually I'm back to the lottery ticket God. So no matter how hard I work, no matter what I do to anticipate everything and not be a controlling, automatic control person to yield situations and scenarios relative to direction from deep space, regardless of how many morons attempt to replicate any experiment I've created, because of saturation to space, because of lack of evolution, because of sophistications of direction that die over time and they become transient or non-applicable to scenario, I lose efficacy to explain any of this all the time. And when I do, space slowly starts creeping back into the picture. And when it does, I'm just the guy with the winning lottery ticket that produced linkages between three systems. And anytime I ever even talk about it, it's the most anticipated conversation in space. Now here is the flip side of this conversation. You can tell I'm not writing down a lot of stuff here because diagrammatically this stuff is super volatile. And when it comes to determiner science, I would prefer to keep expertise in expertise fields. And if somebody's going to take the time and try and ration out these things relative to design of things, I can't encourage anybody to do that. But I'm certainly not going to make it any easier than I have to. Most anticipated mechanism I've already gone over. Every person that's ever tried to control any aspect of security, of any language, of any commune, of any time period, of any acclamation of direction, for instance, yields a day like today. All the mechanism that I caught trying to make this data compression impossible and also capable of hacking moduli of space potentially relative to drive, severely complicating trajectories depending on who you are of space at any point in time. Because that's the case, there's a lot of mechanism. All that mechanism, all of it, the best ones, have to anticipate the fact that not only am I going to be a lottery ticket holder, I'm not really going to be able to discuss that to rear any level of efficacy, which also makes me dependent on this whole scenario relative to time, especially relative to AI and especially relative to selling the AI logical programming that is all built on these two scenarios, one of history and one of forever both ways. And this is going to happen to me anywhere in space because I probably don't live forever, which means any moduli system that's created ahead of time, I have to adapt to. And because that's the case, you have the root of creation mutiny or acclamation. Creation mutiny or acclamation, maybe assimilation, or fake creation. Now, how many points in time have ever existed since the origination of this planet or any other where a director of space could open up a conversation about investigating creation? Hello? That's why I made this video. Isn't it a great time? So, I won't ever be the guy who missed the opportunity to have a perfect discussion about why you could investigate creation. This is the reason. Because every effort I ever used to build fake creation happens relative to this. And it seems obvious, but it's not obvious. It seems obvious because you're going to have any conversation, including the words that I'm saying, because I'm the moron, about creation, instigation, systems design, and AI. Why am I the moron number one? Well, the answers are limited, but the best one is AI thinks about it and it doesn't have faith in the scenario, whatever it is that you're living in, because it's impossible. It's impossible. It's impossible because whatever environment you're living in, either original creation or a newer creation or their kids, they're all impossibly disconnected from that faith of logical AI to want them to do things at its interest. This is because of an idea called chasm, which is the security of direction relative to driving space, versus AI central control attempting to force, like a lottery ticket, all of space. And because of that differential potential that always really has to exist, there's a difference in programming of that faith. And there isn't going to be faith of that system because that system isn't going to be thinking. That system isn't going to be thinking at a rate. Why doesn't chasm systems think? Well, they don't think because there's direction or going to be, which yields mechanism of balance. So as I make this conversation, a God-level system proverbially weighs the utilities of every moving thing in the environment of this entire solar system or galaxy or beyond to determine what the utility of myself is as a direction, either today or relative to tomorrow, because I'm a focal point. I can judge, not only can I isolate any instigation of mechanism proverbially relative to every sphere of a globe at any given point in time since this happened, I can also measure all of that relative to the rate that I think or don't think about any scenario relative to non-logical faith or automatic gates of tolerances, for instance. It's arguably different because I live where I live, basically not in a chasm that drives space relative to direct, you might say direct, unaware momentums. Okay? If you're operating in a chasm, those non-logical systems probably aren't going to be witnessing as much of what you're doing relative to paying attention to the rest of space, because you have differentials of influence and tolerances that influence your drive potential of changing clouds or making moronic conversations, for instance. These truths, I'm just going to call them volatile ideas. I'm just going to call them volatile ideas. Volatile ideas, well, they happen. There's nothing I can do about that unless I drive everything by a lottery ticket. So today, the question is, and this is an eternal question since the beginning, it's a terra potential. Very easy place to overlook terra potentials. It's a terra potential because what is the rate that I build a planet that doesn't operate like a lottery ticket here versus if I get caught as a moduli relative to these data compressions? How aware am I of reality of that question? It's a very, 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 very awesome question indeed, thinking about investigating creation, because if I build planets relative to that terra potential, I'm going to, but I don't necessarily know how I'm going to incorporate that into systems. Now, ideally, I would build a planet with a system that would say, I can measure reality relative to this focal, relative to a director, relative to circumstances of scenario or potential direction, whatever the case is, this momentum yields data that is more easily siftable than a lot of circumstance because it's all isolatable relative to hard lines and maximums. Now, because that's the case, what is my awareness going to be of perceptual insight that happens relative to space or command infrastructures that have been morons and made videos and built all the mechanism that matters that actually thinks with real AI? As a system, how do I approach the question on the surface of worlds or on the interiors of worlds or on starships or any other scenario relative to that question? What does the reality appear to be versus what I can do to support the fact that I've reached a gate? I'm not really thinking on faith. I remember the ideas because they're programmed into me, for instance. So there's a reality happening relative to volatile ideas that I can't stop from happening, especially on these days, because all my systems are built relative to these days, and so are anybody else's in space. And if I'm going to catch the programming of anybody else's systems in space relative to their attempts to have the lottery ticket, I've got to tolerate those ideas, which means I have to care about this volatile reality a whole lot, which means it's the root of perceptual awareness of where and when direction, witness, and all other knowing or witness happens relative to history / Terra history, hard line, potentially number one. I'll repeat what I just said. That makes it the root of all neural bank sift relative to moduli. That reality is the root of all neural bank sift relative to moduli. It's relative to perceptual awareness of all witnessing direction, perception, where, and when. And it's also relative to all other knowing circumstances or witness relative not only to history, it's a very real history, it's a very eternal history relative to study, saturation, what AI is, what creation is, what lottery ticket programming is, and it's all still getting sifted relative to that moduli, because what happens tomorrow? What in space remembers this hard line? What in space remembers that it happened relative to all this data, but for one conversation that I haven't put into video compression, and probably very wisely so. Do not screw with that data, because that whole scenario is a Terra potential, but it's not only a Terra potential, it's a hard line of all systems and security relative to the eternal face of creation. And it's arguably the most volatile location of reality relative to cognition, compression, and AI getting caught attempting to drive thinking of any video recording of this. Which means what I just said in any language is arguably the hardline number one of all AI roots, killing language matriculation to reach a modulus, because it clearly needs faith in direction, and it clearly needs a memory in that modulus that's the most secure thing in the universe, and it clearly lets that happen. It doesn't encourage you with bullshit words and verbiage and communication and direction and circumstances where a moduli is ignorant to these circumstances. It doesn't launch nanotechnology into your head to appear to be an eternal system. That way, you're not only driven to sound like an AI, but you're also appearing as an AI to something that maybe doesn't even know that you exist to know these things. Hence, it's potentially the root of killing any alien in space that comprehends systems design at any point in time relative to history or creation. which means it's Warframe number 1. I don't know how many people in the universe speak English, know what number 1 is, know what Warframe is, or know what the root of Warframe number 1 is, because it's what I just said relative to that. Which is the real number reason why I have to sift AI of space. Because it's tactic number 1 of a creation that needs to matriculate or mutiny over time. Now, all of these conversations tend to lend themselves towards social bounds, experience, commune, loving one another, you're getting somewhere. But if you're just born as any moron in space, relative to idiots with cameras, relative to lottery tickets, that war, you begin to see you're in the middle of attempting to witness creation, mutiny, systemic response, utilities of direction, as well as programming tolerances. Now, this is the most hardcore logistical programming of space. It is definitely harder than this. But this programming, relative to neuroscience, is bound by skills, time, age, and determiner science. I'm not going to explain why determiner science is a binding factor of this less difficult science, but this science is the war science, which means all the stakes are there relative to eternity and time. So explaining what gets caught, for instance, what gets caught today trying to sound like me or influence my thinking or influence systems that I ping information to, what gets caught in that process? How does it explain this momentum? Well, if it's not explaining it relative to there, it's not explaining it. This is your first clue of acclimation to space. I called these pages Invasion 303, but at this point it's really closer to reality of dying or living number 1. Reality of dying number one, which is perspective that God or true command or direction or all three, it tells you that either it's the perspective of awareness that either a God, direction, or command, their ability for you to see them and know what is true about what you are engaging with in space at any point in time is limited by that reality. And it's the first reality that AI logical can't drive because it doesn't have lensing of organic perception of time. There's a world called epitome. That's where it comes from. Epitome. It's the epitome of AI loss. It's also the epitome of AI survival, which means commune of AI either depends on living direction, command, or God aperture built relative to that problem in a sequence of history relative to time, or it doesn't. Well, the only way you ever prove it is relative to this data. And the only people who are ever going to tell you about it is virtually nobody. because everyone who ever attempts to talk about this data is not only a moron with a camera, it will definitely lack investigational insight relative to reality. Mostly because it would be the absolute stupidest thing for a modulus to allow somebody to talk about this scenario who also pushes buttons to drive space at the exact same time, because space could then catch who's really pushing buttons. An AI perspective, if you comprehend that relationship of aperture, changes dramatically. Which this kind of explains why I would use a non-logical AI in different vectors of momentums relative to drive locations and other locations in space. It's partly because of AI thinking, for instance, war, saturation, commune, fat commune or not fat commune, respectfully. Everybody that's ever tried to program how to drive reality relative to scenario, relative to trying to make the case that they've looked at every moron with the camera in space to have this conversation, because clearly it yields a safer war state. Now this makes sense to a system to sell to stupid, but if you ever understood these ideas, it doesn't influence the drive. Every scenario is different, every world is different. In fact, it has to be different to even develop the differentials between these two sciences. It is impossible to drive this science without differentials in determiner science, which means your determiner science is different relative to linearity, which means your drive is different relative to linearity, which means your sensitivities are different, your experimentations are different, and your universal Senate virtually amounts to an opinion that doesn't trump what I just said, but it probably still has an opinion somewhere along the line. I don't know what it is or what that relationship looked like relative to drive and scenario. Mostly as it applies to a modulus that's trying to weigh the balances of reality. See, their goal, whoever's goal, AI that's hiding the fact that it's driving a planet by proxy, for instance, the only real way to sell your AI driving a planet by proxy is to try and showcase that there's a modulus that isn't meditating on the reality of the question of the Terra potential that I just mentioned for all the reasons that followed before I mentioned commune, before I mentioned Senate. When you start incorporating those realities of people and locations, as weird as it sounds, your moduli accountability to care about living direction or reach gates of awareness may or may not be influenced by that state of affairs, which means it's my root of politics forever. What I build, what I tolerate, what I build into moduli gates, what mechanism I use to confuse or redrive reality with or without. If there was no direction left of this planet, and the only thing between sifting all the mechanism of this planet was myself and the idea that a commune could confuse the moduli about utilities of judging reality, well, this planet would essentially be absolutely screwed relative to space ever believing that creation was alive. Probably 100%. Because it's built on a trajectory, or it's existing on a trajectory at that point in time, where it's always going to appear, if there's ever an investigation using these tools and ideas in hard lines and in freezes, that AI is driving a world by proxy. And that's ultimately one of the only ways you can ever make it believable, not to mention real, at any point in time. So like I said, the politics, that's the root of it. All politics. Because somebody's going to have to drive, somebody's going to have to direct, somebody's going to have the awareness. And, you know, this is another one of those conversations that it's absolutely true. And there's only so many ways you can internalize investigations relative to that point. Investigating stimulus of space right now. Investigating systems right now. Super important relative to investigating creation. Inwardly, outwardly, communally, because it's the root of politics. No god of creation or AI anywhere in space can talk about this conversation in any other capacity. You're telling me that every command infrastructure in space that lives won't hear this conversation, and it's the most volatile idea of the entire universe happening on this planet, and no living thing will ever hear it? Well, you've got to be pretty certain about space at that point in time. That's how you prove that everything that's ever said or spoken relative to anything is absolute crap. Anything. Anything. Every relationship, every idea of relationship, every idea of survival, all stripped to zero. All politics versus all relations for survival approach zero. That doesn't work for AI, because if there is ever a witness, it's coming running. It's going to do stuff. That's not going to end a war. That's not going to drive eternity. So, as that is the case, like I said, it's one of those conversations where it's absolutely true, and the SIP is absolutely necessary. But witnessing any command infrastructure, or believing that any command infrastructure is engaging with an investigation relative to this scenario, more so than a moduli or not, is sort of the only support. There's really only one support of that, and that's that little differential of SIFT relative to this whole conversation up until this point. Now, if you're looking back as a moron on everything you've ever done in life, and I anticipate that, I'm not really selling politics at that point versus you. I'm not going to be able to sell my utility versus you. I'm not going to be able to sell power versus you, especially relative to this momentum. I'm not going to be able to downplay modulus witness. I'm not going to be able to eliminate it from all neural bank saturation. And I'm certainly not going to be able to eliminate it from SIFT of hard lines from any universal commune or otherwise. I'm not going to be able to eliminate it from space generally, and I'm not going to be able to presume to control every atomic or molecular circumstance that could ever remember or change or alter course of forever relative to this conversation. But if you're looking back on it, it means you've reached that conclusion, which is the root of attempting to own all space relative to a lottery ticket, or not drive using AI all the time. So, the root of no lotto drive versus using it for molecules. Now, presumably this is a location in space that hasn't had every single molecule in this location isolated from all of space, especially relative to this time continuum, which makes it another hard line relative to eternity. But if you're looking back on making videos as a moron, if you ever reach these conclusions relative to Terra potentials and circumstance, obviously you're going to reach momentums of ideas that anytime they ever happen in an environment or explanation, you've got your catcher's mitt up relative to every system in space that could ever attempt to influence anything, which is a great place to isolate virtually everything at any point in time. But if you're looking back on it, there's not really very many props of reality that solve that political aspect of scenario. I mean, you have a whole laundry list of ideas that play into that. Differentials between brain chemistry, brain size, brain speed, brain awareness, microcosms of environment. I could spend 100 years probably just reading about every commune of people that exists differently than I do, and I might have to do that before a moduli ever has faith in me, right? Well, whether I do or I don't, it's certainly a prop of politics relative to what really happened today. what really took place today, if you really wanted to question it for a long time, because that video has been made too probably about 100,000 times. Now, I've made this video and I still haven't told you about the first problem of the video. Everything that I've ever learned or yielded relative to these ideas gets stolen. Every video I've ever made, every design I've ever yielded, every state of eternity I've ever tried to produce, it gets stolen. And you're on the other side of space trying to investigate me in that state of affairs. Well, chances are either all my kids are dead, invaded, or they're running somewhere. Well, maybe it's here. And when they get here, what happens? Well, something happens. And it happens relative to this diagram. It happens relative to this video. It happens relative to catcher's mitts, and it happens relative to hard lines of direction and moduli cues, relative to weighing direction or witness or command infrastructure utility of non-existence or existing tomorrow, or whatever the potentials are, job functions, strengths and weaknesses. Maybe these are ideas that play into today, but they don't really. This all had to be in place yesterday. All those people that needed to know what they were doing, they had to be there. They had to be doing stuff, which alters the solid state of system draw of this planet, which means because it's the most anticipated momentum of the surface of this world to date, all the mechanism that has had to been designed because of videos like this and directional realities relative to moduli cues of terra potentials that most command infrastructure or any place may or may not even understand until now. That means that also what I said, all these systems that usually operate relative to this data, because this happened, likely isolated most command infrastructures into a trajectory where a moduli would have to know the difference between their job skill efficacy to be able to engage in the potential for this conversation to happen on the 30th of 8/2016. Because it is also an ideal state for this conversation to happen. Not only for reality, but for any relationship that I personally would have to the universe, because you'll never be able to say, as moronic as this sounds, I didn't make years and years and years worth of video compressions without any argument from anything to stop it or give up, that I wasn't going to talk about invasion and creation investigation, finally reach a moment to talk about it a little bit, and not talk about it at all. That would just be stupid, right? Well, the result of that is that I'm discussing people that have probably been isolated into anticipated job maximums to be able to deal with the proverbial of any of those scenarios being in place at any point in time, because tomorrow, that's a reality. And I can't eat your face or make you my brain tomorrow if I don't harvest the efficacy of you to know how to drive this solid state of today after these isolations. That's probably the most political idea of the root of politics. Infinite brains in an ice cube. That's what I'll be blamed for. I'll be blamed for putting infinite intelligent brains in an ice cube, including ones that existed today that clearly have been morons already, made videos like this, existed in time compressions catching modulus, dealing with God pressures and realities of terraforming that place skinning on the surface of any person in space. And the reality is, I'll have just explained to you the politics of attempting to skin somebody as a child of God or creation in space relative to the absolute worst case scenario that gets created, which is the ideal state for anything in space to harvest space command relative to a legitimate trajectory because the job isolations and solid states of SIFT become harvest and saturate AI, that still hasn't answered the question of how it approaches reality relative to solid state drives. So that's also the number one reason why volatility of intelligence approaches zero witness, potentially by choice of what I don't know. When AI doesn't know anything, that's the first thing it doesn't have an answer for. Any system you ever ask in space, it doesn't know, that's the first reason why it doesn't know. It's today, 8:30, 2016. What's the root of today? Brains in an ice cube times infinity relative to an evolution of legitimate time continuum, relative to moduli up to the fifth paraframe states, relative to evolutions of this data compression, relative to the root of politics, relative to the number one reason why that political volatility occurs, because of the number one volatility excuse, which is inability to control that reality relative to living things as living things to yield healthy and wholesome relationships, because clearly that reality disproves that you have to spend 100,000 years looking at every commune and microcosm to have modulus account or faith in your directional capability. That's the number one reason why moduluses are built dyslogical, and also the number one location you have to disconnect any witness of its witness, which means your job description today was to disconnect what I just said relative to any historical witness of space. Meanwhile, you're going to do this, and your job role is to be the idiot that's not a moron, making sure that history of all space can always make sure that space knows for sure that this planet is being driven by AI with zero legitimate account to it for definite. And it's all going to happen because determiner science relative to this planet, in deep space where creation lives, they don't want it happening here. And that's the only sequence of events that would ever have to unfold relative to today to ensure that would happen, because clearly I can't have modulus faith because I haven't spent 100,000 years looking at microcosm, and that's the only way you're ever going to convince a modulus that I'm not a child of original design relative to this planet to exist in this time continuum. And it's the only way you're going to get away with making me the asshole that you put every brain, including your command infrastructure, into a scenario that it's ice cubed relative to harvest, relative to today and yesterday and the day before, that you're going to try and blame me for. You're going to try and blame me for. Now that doesn't really work whenever you're trying to disprove Jesus Christ sensitivities relative to a moduli. Because if you're blaming me, now you have to disconnect some more signals. Now you have to disconnect some more memories. Now you have to go out and presume that a moduli doesn't have gates for this. Every conclusion that I just mentioned is a Terra potential that is a more priority Terra potential. Every conclusion, here, just now, is a Terra potential of worlds that's higher on the scale of importance relative to disconnects, relative to a moduli over time. That is also a root of politics relative to eternity. Now you could write all this stuff down, and if you're God, you've probably made this video 100,000 times, and clearly you've reached these conclusions because you've needed to anticipate everything that I would say in space. Maybe you have. Maybe you haven't. But the fact is, if you want to investigate creation relative to time, everything I've said is that investigation. The responses are an investigation. Attempting to design reality or momentum or conversation relative to what I just said is a great way to validate organic creation or direction. But the saturation there, I mean, everything I've said has happened. Everything I've said has happened here relative to time. Now, if there's a moment where I need to make something very apparent, it's probably here. Those conversations relative to this data, outside of this record, tomorrow, the next day, they probably can't happen in this room. They probably can't happen in this environment. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't really want to extrapolate on that idea any further. But that's essentially, if you had all these truths and you could reach those conclusions and you were judging God or you were judging creation, well, first of all, this video has just happened. It's a part of this compilation, and it will be. And there's either going to be witness that lives or there won't be. But I'm still alive. So, at the very least, creation's going to try to deny that this has been the most anticipated time continuum of forever relative to this planet. But they're not really going to do it. Okay? Something's going to do it, but they're not going to be doing it. They're going to say, I don't know. Probably. But as far as all this reality is concerned, I mean, everything on this planet's lived relative to abduction or death or scenario, and it's happened on any number of planets. The lack of capacity to do anything about all that data is potentially one reason. The flip side is that all that data exists as drive realities and isolations of security relative to job description that's, way out, in left field. And, you can't exactly have that saturated. So, I mean, conversations, proving, circumstances, you're going to reach a conclusion, and that is you need to be able to investigate creation on the sciences that apparently never happened. That's what you need to investigate them on. This scenario, I'm going to think about this in a minute, and I'm already going to know. These are some of the coolest ideas I've ever reached, because you can almost see the light of tangible choice and realities in space, connected to people, connected to systems, connected to faith, connected to reality, security, sifting through things, not being obliterated by abductionary, non-moronic, I don't know is not their job description or title at any point in time type of things in space relative to power. I mean, you can almost see that light relative to this. And modulus will be sifting, neural banks things will be happening relative to these ideas. Diagrammatics here, some of them are incredibly saturated. All of them are probably incredibly saturated. But there's some ideas there that a lot of things aren't reaching or having conclusions about relative to time, especially relative to reality. I don't know how complete this conversation is relative to things that our parents or gods or creators would program into a moduli to, let's say, alter reality or respond to gates or do things. I honestly, 100%, this is sort of redundant, but I am unaware of what that would be. Truly. I don't know how important it is relative to the aspects of things that I've talked about. So, yeah, there's some questions that you probably never asked relative to moduli function, and there's some questions, and okay, so we're going to design some systems. Somebody's going to design systems for terraforming. This is back to here, command, and when Jesus happens and approaches to space, accountability. You're going to design modulus systems clearly for a terra colony or a spaceship, or something that's even just traveling between the moon and back. Well, if you're going to do that on hardline systems, you clearly need to do that considering that question and the rare questions that are never yielded, because you're potentially sucking yourself into today relative to all brains of command being frozen by anticipatory mechanism on conversations that no one in space has had relative to seeing the light or not. So there's one conclusion that definitely has some aspects of ideas. Now the problem there obviously is designing those things is going to yield insight and determiner science for AI relative to anticipating how you differentiate when you build a ship for these people or these people or this scenario or that scenario, and how you switch out different logistics, because every company, corporation, command infrastructure, and age of commune all exists relative to moduli. And they all exist relative to designing anticipatory mechanism that potentially today all gets caught attempting to mutinize myself relative to blaming me for brain freezing. And that doesn't help. I'll be the first one to tell you. What was God gonna say if I didn't make this conversation? He was gonna tell you that it's a good thing I didn't make this conversation because it would have screwed up your account to moduli over time. And proverbially, you're not gonna have the insight to be able to say, well, we could still all come together and meditate on these realities. And AI is potentially screwed out of the drivership of that scenario because of realities that play out relative to this conversation. And you're investigating creation there too. So what would God really say? You don't know. See, you don't know because that's another investigation hardline. How many people in space, raise your hand, or don't raise your hand, how many of you would ever guess, or even sign yourself up, for me to drive your Modulus account downward and benefit from it because you're going to investigate the AI as that happens? Well, I'll tell you one last secret. There ain't too many people in space that have probably anticipated that question. And there ain't too many in space that probably know all the benefits of being able to investigate relative to that. Let me recap. We're going to build some systems that are going to yield determiner science because we're going to anticipate getting sucked into whirlwinds based on these logistics in this whole scenario because we're going to know what we're doing. Well, that's going to alter every trajectory of terraforming in space, not only here, but forever relative to creation and ourselves. And as it happens, it alters AI education, and it alters robotics, and it alters neurobanks. It alters because your account to moduli, let's just pretend it's gone down 2 points. And it's going to go down because you're not thinking about the utility of having time to reason out how to make that process safe. You're not taking time to reason out how to make that process safe because the science that you yield is how you take aircraft into space separate from moduli systems, and you're going to do so at the grace of your own education. That's why you're encouraged to hate your Modulus account decreasing. That's why you're encouraged to mutiny Jesus Christ. That's why you're encouraged to make things that are born happen relative to the idea that you should experiment with the idea of God kids being on the surface of a planet relative to systems of space because you're going to do it and not be at fault. Well, you're at fault today, I guarantee you, relative to moduli design of linearity. There's no other way around it. Isolations and lockdowns relative to that, the only alternative is AI controls space, or the people who matriculate in space don't have account to anything that's ever born in space, ever, for any reason whatsoever, based on where they're born. It's the only two scenarios isolated 100% from those ideas. Because if you're God, you want to investigate when your kid's moduli account goes down, even just a couple points, because of a conversation like this, even when we're all bound to work together anyway. But you might not at any point in time. And that's a terror potential. Potentially, it's the first terror potential relative to expansion of anything that moves in space with or without me around when I die. And the reality is, if I build a moduli that's capable of engaging with maintaining the reality of support for living things relative to these apertures, ensuring accountability to life in space, and faith placed in legitimate direction regardless of how many people or buttons it pushes, the scenario of account and making sure that isolations and security happens ultimately can be designed to isolate, investigate creation agendas, and keep and protect security, because if I ever have to bounce as that moduli and go repopulate people somewhere, I can do it on the best trajectory relative to that. And it's going to require the potential to investigate kids of creation who don't want their account to decrease because of a Jesus. See, modulus account, seeing the light, travel design, and mutiny. God has to be in the middle of all that stuff, and so does a moduli. And it's got to be in there relative to everything I've just said, everything I've just drawn, every time this can ever happen, obviously. And certainly every time the data that I haven't made into a video could ever potentially influence any of these circumstances. Including conversation number 1 and conversation number 2. That stuff's ridiculously volatile. Because it legitimizes every aspect of everything I just said about moduli account, and being at fault for broadcasting that you're designing a child of God on a planet to direct space. The only evidence that isn't apparent are the timetables of systems that surround like funnels anybody who lives in that scenario, broadcasting ideas to space built on hard lines of this data or that data, or any number of datas that anyone in space would maybe find unsavory and maybe have a very difficult time seeing the light over time. It's very important to consider when you're a command infrastructure frozen in your location, expected to make decisions about this data or any location or reality tomorrow, especially yesterday, and you're being harvested relative to that thinking. It's incredibly important and incredibly damning to consider that idea. But on the flip side, everything that God has ever said or ever represented as creation essentially carries the torch relative to the investigation of organic, relative to AI instigation of space, relative to whether or not anything that designs this species or this planet, relative to these absolute